This is a Rough Tiger production.
And you, and you, and you, and you were there. Some of it wasn't very nice, but most of it was beautiful.
Hey, hey.
Hello, Bryan. Hello, listeners. This is Dream Idiots.
What's new?
Not a lot. It is a beautiful sunny day here. The snow is starting to melt. It is feeling like that wonderful time that's going to fake you out right before it snows one last time, right around Mother's Day.
Right. Just before it dumps another what, 50? Yeah, last year didn't dump 15 inches like on Mother's Day.
Yes, it did.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just the
God,
last week
all I
of
can say is
February.
God bless Texas.
There's just last week of February, so we still got a ways to go here in Colorado before things really get going.
Right.
So. As I said, this is Dream Idiots. You can find us in a number of places, both for your listening pleasure, both here in podcast land and on terrestrial radio. We are with KXEP 101.5 in San Antonio, and now we're also working with Owl Vision. Is that correct, Bryan? I just found that out this afternoon through you.
Owl Radio apparently has requested to repurpose our content as well. Owl Radio, I believe, is set up as a nonprofit, but I know that they offer quite a bit in the way of audio content, reading books, reading periodicals, those types of things, and making that a content available online for the blind and visually impaired. So that really couldn't be any cooler. And
Yes.
so we're excited about that.
Yes, that is very, very cool stuff. And you can find us at a variety of places online for your amusement. We do have what's all the stuff, Bryan? You have it memorized. I still do not, despite us being over 100 episodes into it. What's our stuff they can find us at?
You can check us out
Yeah.
at dreamidiots.com. We're on Instagram and Facebook at Dream Idiots. And whatever platform you're listening on, if you don't mind going on there, shooting us 5 stars, giving us a review, that would be hugely helpful. Helps the algorithms do something that's beneficial to us. And you can drop us a line at dreamidiotspodcast@gmail. And also, audio and video is available of our talking heads on Patreon. So patreon.com/Dream Idiots. So there you have it.
All righty. And you don't need to, we don't have a paywall on Patreon either. That's
No,
just
the
for
paywall is
just for
there.
giggles.
For those, I genuinely, I don't think we have a single paid person, and the paid content only gets you the same content, but you can see us talking. There's no visuals. It's just Morris
Mhm.
and I, two men in glasses and headphones talking. So it's not great video, but if you're
But
dying
it
to
is
see us,
there.
but it is there. It is an option.
And before we started, Bryan, you said you don't have any announcements or updates. That is
No updates from me.
correct.
Correct.
I do have one announcement. It is February 27th, which means that Thursday will be February 29th, Leap Day. I wanted
Mhm.
to extend a special birthday greeting to all the Leap babies out there. One in particular, my late friend Charles Morden, who passed away a few years back. He would have turned 52 Thursday or 13, depending on how you do the math. Charles was a great guy, good card player, funny guy. He did a great bit. He went to college in New York and had the opportunity to see Springsteen live several times and did a really funny bit about a couple from New Jersey that he called Anthony and Dolores at a Springsteen concert. Anthony, when's he going to play Born to Run? And he would go off on a tangent about Anthony and Dolores getting into a fight at a Springsteen concert. Uh, Chaz, you are missed. Happy birthday wherever you are. I hope you're having a good time, buddy. Um, so happy birthday to all the other leap babies out there this leap year 2024.
Absolutely.
All right. It is 108. I get to go first. Bryan, are you
You're
ready?
up. I'm ready.
All right, Bryan. It occurred to me that we are in the final week of Black History Month, and I had not contributed a story to that effort so far. So I wanted to rectify that and tell you about Dr. Charles Drew.
Okay, Charles Drew, not familiar.
Okay, I think it'll start to tickle some of those synapses that are slowly popping off in our brains here in a moment. Dr. Charles Drew was born in Washington, D.C. on June 3rd, 1904. He was not born a doctor, he was born a baby. But that would be cool if he'd come out a doctor wearing a little lab coat and one of those little reflecty things. His family was middle class. He grew up in the racially integrated neighborhood of Foggy Bottom, which is a pretty cool name. He had a job delivering newspapers as a young man and graduated from Dunbar High School in 1922. He attended Amherst College on an athletic scholarship where he played football and ran track. After graduation in 1926, he taught at Morgan College in Baltimore as a professor of biology and chemistry, two of my least favorite subjects, to be perfectly honest. He also served as the athletic director, and he saved his earnings here for medical school. He applied to both Howard and Harvard medical schools, but lacked a few prerequisites, so he attended McGill University in Montreal instead. He studied with John Beatty and became interested in blood transfusion process and how it relates to treating shock. What was paramount here was location. Blood did not travel well, and treating shock patients via transfusion required proximity to a blood bank. Drew earned his Doctor of Medicine and Master of Surgery in 1933, placing second in a class of 127. He taught pathology as a faculty instructor at Howard from 1935 to 1936 and served as assistant surgeon and surgical instructor at Freedman's Hospital, which was connected to Howard. And he pursued graduate work at Columbia University, earned a Doctor of Science in 1940. He was the first African American to earn a Doctor of Science. His doctoral thesis was titled Banked Blood, a Study in Blood Preservation. It was here where Drew's work would shape the nature of blood transfusions and save countless lives. He figured out something very important. Preserved blood lasted longer if you were to separate the cells from the plasma. Remember, blood isn't just a liquid, it's made up of a bunch of things. The cell part, the white blood cells, the red blood cells, and then reconstitute the blood later when it was needed. In 1940, he was named the medical director of the Blood for Britain project, and this was based out of New York. He set the standards for blood collection, plasma separation, contamination mitigation, storage, testing, and transportation. So he's doing all of these things. Some 15,000 people donated blood for the project. The resulting vials were sent to Great Britain to aid soldiers and civilians during World War II, because by 1940, World War II was well underway.
Right.
So in addition to the Lend-Lease programs and these things that were going on, Americans were actually sending blood over to Great Britain. In February of 1941, he became medical director for the first American Red Cross blood bank, and he proceeded to create the first blood mobiles, the mobile donation systems capable of refrigeration, which allowed for longer transportation and storage times of blood. The Red Cross worked with the Army and the Navy. Drew resigned in protest from the American Red Cross in 1942. Do you want to guess why he resigned, Brian?
From the Red Cross?
In protest in 1942.
Oh, blood was only the reconstituted blood was only being given to white soldiers. No.
Very close. The Red
Really?
Cross initially, very, very, very close. The Red Cross initially
I've said it before and I will say it again. Every story we tell is ultimately the story of racism.
because the Red Cross initially refused to take blood from African American donees. And even after the institution started accepting blood from African Americans, get this, the blood donated by them was stored separately from the blood donated by Caucasians. So you had segregated blood banks.
Oh my God. How stupid can you be?
Now, there are 8 different types of blood, right? O negative, O positive, A positive, A
Right.
negative, AB negative. It doesn't matter if
Right.
who it came from.
Right.
Drew continued working as a physician and an educator after he left the Red Cross. On April 1st, 1950, Drew and three other African-American physicians were driving from Washington, D.C. to Tuskegee, Alabama for an annual free clinic they all participated in. Drew, exhausted from a long session in the operating room the night before, fell asleep while driving. The car flipped 3 times and came to rest on a stretch of road outside of Burlington, North Carolina. 2 of the doctors traveling with him were relatively unhurt. The third, Dr. Ford, suffered a broken arm and an injured knee. Drew, however, had been fatally injured. He was taken to Alamont's General Hospital in Burlington, where he was treated. Several of the medical staff there, both black and white, knew who he was. They knew him by name, if not by sight. The 2 white surgeons on duty, who happened to be brothers, Charles and Harold Kernodle, knew of Drew's work with plasma and blood banks. Drew was in terrible shape when he arrived. "I tried to get an open airway," said nurse and anesthetist Lucille Crabtree. "It wasn't even an hour till he was dead. His chest was crushed. His head was crushed and broken. There was nothing anyone could do." The doctors had contemplated transferring Drew to Duke Medical Center, but believed he would not survive the 45-minute trip. Dr. Charles Drew died 2 months shy of his 46th birthday. Dr. Ford, the physician who was injured with the broken arm, spent a few nights in the ward for African Americans, which was in the basement of the hospital.
Of course.
He commended the medical treatment he had received, but said, quote, "The accommodations were crummy." The hospital administrator there agreed and apologized profusely. Word spread in the local communities around the hospital that a prominent African American physician had died. The State Highway Commission painted a large circle with an X inside it on the North Carolina Highway 49 to mark the spot of the accident. This was not common. Folks felt it was done by the Highway Commission to show that, quote, "a noble person had passed away." Hubert Humphrey, congressman from Minnesota, requested that Drew's obituary and a Washington Post editorial about Drew be read into the congressional record. Almost immediately, a story began to circulate that Drew was refused treatment at Alamont's because of his race, and that the creator of the blood banking system had ironically bled to death. This story persisted for years, particularly through the black middle class, despite the best efforts of people like schoolteacher Viola Covington Morris, Dr. C. Mason Quick, and historian John Hope Franklin. Mrs. Morris was a schoolteacher who came to the accident scene to offer assistance. She knew of the efforts of the medical staff at Alamont's to save Dr. Drew's life, but she understood why the story of ill treatment persisted through the years. Quoting her, "People talk that way because it happened to us all of our lives," she said. Dr. C. Mason Quick, who had been trained by Dr. Drew, raced to Alamont's hospital to assist his mentor. Dr. Quick arrived as Dr. Drew died, but witnessed the effort of the Alamont's hospital staff. Dr. Quick tried for years to convince other black doctors that the story of Drew's ill treatment was a myth. John Hope Franklin, historian and future recipient of the Presidential Medal of Honor, knew the story, Presidential Medal of Freedom, knew the story was erroneous, but understood the context of the times made the dissemination of the story almost inevitable. Drew had already been mistreated by whites at the time. The American Medical Association would not admit black physicians. The Red Cross, as I mentioned earlier, would only grudgingly take blood from black citizens and then promptly segregate it from the, quote, white blood. Plus, there were actual historical examples of blacks being denied treatment, as Franklin could attest to personally. In 1931, Franklin was a student at Fisk University in Nashville when tragedy struck. The university's dean of women, Juliet Derricotte, was traveling through Georgia with 3 undergraduates. They were involved in a car accident near Dalton. Derricotte and Nina Johnson, one of the students, died of their injuries when they were refused treatment in Dalton's segregated hospital. Sometime in the late 40s, a black doctor named P.W. Hill of Clarksdale, Mississippi, faced the deathly dangerous choice of trying to get his pregnant wife, who needed an emergency cesarean section, admitted to the closest hospital, which was segregated, or make an 80-mile drive to a black hospital in Memphis. He chose the latter. His wife and child died on the road. The story of Drew's death and perceived mistreatment persisted not for years, but for decades. Comedian, writer, activist, and all-around great human being Dick Gregory repeated the myth in one of his books in the 1960s and again in a 1987 interview. My first exposure to the story of Dr. Charles Drew came while watching a MASH rerun, the 1973 second season episode titled Dear Dad 3. A wounded soldier demands to not be given, and then he spews out a racial slur, blood. So the doctors save his life and then pull a prank on him by darkening his skin with iodine and pull all kinds of pranks to make a very specific point that blood is blood. And they tell the soldier the story of Dr. Charles Drew, complete with the mistreatment at the unnamed hospital. But perhaps the greatest conflation of facts comes from this event. On December 1st, 1950, exactly 8 months after Drew's death, Malthias Reeves Avery also had an automobile accident in the same county. He was also taken to Alamance and diagnosed. He needed more care than the hospital could provide. 30 to 45 minutes had passed since his arrival at Alamance. Avery was sent on to Duke Hospital over in Durham. After 35 to 45-minute trip, he spent another 10 minutes at Duke and was refused treatment there because all of the, quote, black beds were full. He was sent on to Lincoln, Durham's black hospital. Doctors there never received notice that Avery was en route. He died minutes after arrival, never having gained consciousness. In addition to being regarded as one of the great medical researchers of the 20th century, I'm of the opinion that Dr. Charles Drew might be responsible for saving more lives than just about anybody else in the same time span. There's also a whole bunch of places named after him. There are 11 medical or higher education buildings named after him across 7 states and Washington, D.C., 16 schools of primary education across 10 states and D.C., and a park in southwest Montreal. His home in Arlington, Virginia, was placed on the National Historic Landmarks list by the National Park Service in 1976. He had a stamp issued in his honor in 1981. A marker was erected by the Omega Psi Phi fraternity and friends in 1986 on the site of the crash, in a spot just off North Carolina Highway 49. And that is the story of Dr. Charles Drew and his contributions to the world of blood transfusions and blood banking.
Wow.
Sources for this piece, the Historical Marker Database, Wikipedia, and an excellent book that I cannot recommend highly enough, One Blood, The Death and Resurrection of Charles Drew, University of North Carolina Press, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, the Kindle edition from the year 2000, written by Spency Love. A terrific look at the way that the myth persisted, why it persisted, and how the story of his mistreatment was both true and not true at the same time. The importance of myth and legend, the way that oral histories take the place of written history when you are a part of a culture that is denied written history, and how oral traditions have to take over in cases such as this. So,
Right.
does this ring any bells after telling the story?
Yeah, I did not know or had forgotten his name. Obviously, knew the reference from MASH because you and I both watched that TV show, on a loop. So I saw every episode of MASH, I'm sure at least 10 times over the years. And so, and little surprise that story would be repeated as fact because, the African American community in this country expects unfairness. And so, someone plants this seed that obviously, this seems like a disparity. This seems cruel and probably unfair based on what happened out on that road. And so it probably is. And so if that type of disparity, that type of lack of fairness is common, of course you're going to expect to see it. So no wonder it would be oft repeated and accepted as fact because You're in a marginalized group that's always going to be overlooked and put down and maligned and mistreated. So of course, it's crappy in every way, but no surprise.
Especially when there's historical precedent for it actually happening to people when
Right, right,
they were denied treatment and sent away and
right,
all of these awful things. Um, I think his importance medically cannot be denied. I mean, I don't think we
right. I
could.
mean, tens of
Um,
thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. I mean,
I,
what? Potentially could be millions of people who have been directly impacted by it.
yeah,
And you can absolutely assume that maybe if his injuries had been somewhat less severe and he could have sought treatment, that this could have been the outcome, right? Maybe there was an avenue there where the collision was not as severe and he could have been treated. Would he have been treated? Who knows? Again, you have to assume the worst because he was African American.
yeah. He was treated, and all of the doctors who were with him were they were absolutely complimentary of the white doctors at the hospital, but they were also of the belief that no one could have survived that. That it was
Right,
just that they
right,
knew
right.
at the site that he was not going to make it. Um, and then there's the case of the doctor who was with the broken arm, Dr. Ford, who was, you know, yeah, I'm sitting here in the basement. Um,
Right.
yeah, this is awful. This is
There's no
crummy.
view.
Yeah. Um, and the Alamance was also a private hospital, which is interesting as well.
Right.
Um, so you've got these state-supported hospitals that are still able to, at that time, able to turn away patients. Um, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah. It's just insane. How was that ever allowed or legal or it's just unbelievable?
yeah,
Yeah.
the book One Blood by Spency Love is terrific. You can find it there's a Kindle edition for it. You can find it in a variety of places. Terrific read. Um, I highly recommend it, and it's really a very interesting look at one of the premier scientists of the 20th century, Dr.
Wow.
Charles Drew.
Yeah. And this is, as we're wrapping up Black History Month, this is actually, I believe, the 12th anniversary of the death of Trayvon Martin. So I read a brief summary on that horrific case, and again, just another example of why African Americans in this country look for and expect racism. Look for that level of cruelty.
It's hard to say anything else. So
Yeah, yeah, no, yeah.
it's just awful.
Definitely, a little bit heavy this week on Dream Idiots. So, but super interesting and compelling story. Thank you.
Hmm. Do we have anything to lighten the mood before our next story?
Yes. We do have a curse word.
It's time for the Dream Idiot's curse word of the week.
Curse word is Collyer, Collyer. Ever heard of Collyer before? Collyer.
I know Collier's magazine, but that's spelled entirely differently.
Okay.
So,
All right. So
nope.
the curse word actually dovetails nicely into my story this week. Homer Lusk Collyer was born November 6th, 1881.
Oh,
His brother, Langley, was born 4 years later, October of 1885. You just made a noise, like a noise of recognition.
yeah. Now I recognize it.
Okay, okay. So the Collyer brothers, they were the sons of Herman Livingston Collyer. He was a gynecologist in Manhattan who worked mostly at Bellevue Hospital. Herman Livingston Collyer, for some reason, married his first cousin. People, stop marrying your cousins. I'm looking at you, Alabama. Quit doing that. His first cousin, Susie Gage Frost, who had been an opera singer. The brothers claim that their ancestors had traveled to America from Europe on a ship called the Speedwell that arrived in Massachusetts just a week after the Mayflower did in 1620. Homer and Langley attended Columbia University, actually shortly after Columbia moved to its current location in Morningside Heights. Homer had a degree in admiralty law, which sounds dull as paste, and Langley tinkered around in chemistry and engineering. Langley was
What is
also
Admiralty law? What is that? Is that
admiral is vessels, seafaring, is maritime stuff,
it's
I
like
think.
maritime law? Oh,
I,
okay.
yeah, how maritime is different from admiralty law, I couldn't even begin to tell you. So very esoteric. So Langley was a concert pianist. I actually played professionally for a period of time, performed at Carnegie Hall at least once. And Langley was a layman of the Trinity Church, and it was claimed that the Colliers had been members of this church since the late, for like nearly 200 years, for a long, long time. 1909, the good doctor moves his family to a delightful four-story brownstone in Harlem at 2078 Fifth Avenue. Dr. Collyer was definitely known to be a bit of an oddball, and he did, well, it sounds like he principally worked at Bellevue. He did, for a period of time, work at City Hospital on Blackwell's Island, later known as Roosevelt Island, which we've discussed on this podcast. And he would get to Blackwell's Island by throwing a canoe in the East River and paddling down
Ooh.
to go to work. And after work, he would paddle across back to Manhattan and pull the canoe out of the water and walk home.
Just portage it back, huh?
Yeah, and I mean, I've moved a canoe before. Moving canoes is a two-person task. This must be closer to a kayak, I would imagine. Carrying a canoe with one person on city streets, that seems insane, but apparently he did it. About 10 years later, the good doctor and his wife separate. Collyer moves to a new home up on West 77th Street, while mom stays in the Harlem brownstone. The boys, actually, through their whole life, they never marry, they never have children, they never live on their own. And at the time, they chose to remain with their mom, even though they were adults. The good doctor dies in 1923, leaving all of his possessions to his children, including from his medical practice. So they move a whole bunch of medical stuff into the home on Fifth Avenue. And then mom dies in 1929, leaving all of her possessions as well in this four-story Harlem brownstone.
He died in a canoeing accident on Broadway, correct?
Right. Hit by a taxi. So after mom dies,
handsome cab took him out on.
So after mom dies, the brothers, they keep living in the brownstone, and for about the next 4 years, 5 years, they're socializing and having a life, going out of the home on a regular basis. Homer is practicing law. Langley is working as a piano dealer. They would teach Sunday school at Trinity Church, but in 1933, Homer loses his eyesight due to some sort of cranial hemorrhage. So he's now blind. Langley quits his job to take care of his brother, and they both sort of completely withdraw from life. Time starts to progress, and their propensity to wanting to stay home gets even worse because the diversity in the neighborhood starts to change. There's a period of time when area in Harlem had been upper class, but starts to become predominantly an African American neighborhood due to the effects of the Great Depression, and so they have mental health issues now because they're starting to be shut-ins and they're fearful of the outside world, and so they just stay home. At one point, Langley is quoted as saying, quote, "We just don't want to be bothered," unquote. So rumors start to persist about their life and their lifestyle and how just weird and unconventional it is. And so this is before, Instagram and TikTok. They would actually have crowds congregate outside their home, which I can't imagine anything more boring because nothing's happening. You're just looking at a house. No one's coming in or out. It's just a brick facade. But large numbers of people would gather in their hundreds to see if something was going to happen. But again, This attention only stokes the fire even more and makes their eccentricities even worse. Teenagers, on a few different occasions, throw rocks at the windows, so the windows get boarded up. The doors are wired shut. Rumors start to spread through the neighborhood that obviously there must be piles of gold in there and piles of cash and fine art and valuables and rugs and all these fabulous things, right? So rumors persist that was the case. So people then start attempting to break in and steal things. So in an attempt to prevent that from happening, even though the rumors are not true, Langley, who's our tinkerer, starts to construct little tunnels, and the house kind of turns into a great big fat maze with little nests of living spaces, and the place is heavily booby trapped with all kinds of things where things will fall on you, things will poke you, things will stab you, things will trap you if you don't know where the traps are. So the house becomes just a maze of boxes with a tunnel system, and there's junk and trash and tripwires, and it's just insane. Homer and Langley have just these, it's a 4-story place. I don't know how many of these little nests they had in the debris. There must have been, 1 or 2 on each floor, I would guess. I don't know. So Langley, continues just tinkering along here with various devices and inventions. He apparently makes a device that is good for vacuuming out the inside of a piano. Somehow inside the house he has a full Model T, which I don't know how the hell he would have gotten it in there, but must have been a jillion years before, because Model Ts were, came out World War I era, but somehow tinkered with it and adapted it so it could generate electricity. But mostly his gig was taking care of Homer. He, fed his brother, bathed him, read him from periodicals, read classic literature, because he could no longer see, would play the piano for him. And Langley was convinced that he could basically cure Homer, of his ailments and of his blindness through diet and rest. Langley concocted a diet for Homer consisting of 100 oranges a week. No, thank you. Black bread.
Oh my God.
I mean, first of all, in this period, how would you get 100 oranges a week? First of all, let alone consume them. Something called black bread, which I don't know whether that's just like overly burnt bread. I don't know. And peanut butter. He was convinced that for some reason this concoction or this combination would cure his blindness. But Homer becomes paralyzed shortly thereafter due to rheumatism. And they both completely eschew any medical treatment because they don't trust doctors. They're the children of a doctor. And again, for reasons we can't even begin to speculate to, they are convinced that going to a doctor will make him worse. The doctors, if we go to a doctor, they'll obviously sever his optic nerve. Why would they do that? Of course not. And whatever drugs they would give him would just hasten his death. So Langley was quoted later as saying, "You must remember that we are the sons of a doctor. We have a medical library of 15,000 books in our house. We decided we would not call in any doctors. You see, we know too much about medicine." So Langley now is venturing out, but he's only doing so after midnight. He'd walk all over the city for miles and miles, going from Harlem all the way out to Brooklyn by foot to find bread. He was just one of those, he would just pick food out of the garbage. He would go to restaurants, butchers, grocers, whoever had spare food that was being thrown out, he would collect. But he also is just walking the streets. He would just be kind of a treasure dog, just anything that had a bit of wire to it, or that was shiny, or that had whatever that might seem like it had some use or some value. He would pick it up and schlep it home. By the early 1930s, the brownstone, this house, is just falling down around their ears, obviously, because because all they're doing is tinkering and and collecting stuff. So by their phone had been disconnected in 1917. They never bothered to reconnect it because they didn't have anyone to call or talk to. 10 years later, electricity, water, and gas were also all turned off by 1928. So they're warming this gigantic house with one kerosene heater. And then that same Model T Langley tried to use as a source of heat at one point, but that didn't work. He would fetch water from a nearby park, and the only news they got from the outside world was, I mean, I guess, obviously they're collecting newspapers, but at one point Langley actually made a radio so they could listen to the radio. Which again, if you can do that from scratch, you're no dummy.
No.
People in the neighborhood, shopkeepers, whoever, who would occasionally see Langley, said he was always polite and rational, but he was crazy. So you describe someone as both rational and crazy. Okay. But he was also kind of disheveled all the time. He had this kind of long, droopy mustache, always wore this sort of oversized hat. His clothes were just, beaten to, held together by pins and by threads. So he would occasionally go out and interact with people a little bit. Homer hadn't been seen since he went blind, since 1933. And Langley, when he wasn't taking care of his brother, was just protecting him from any sort of exposure or exchange with anyone in the outside world. At one point, they caught neighbors attempting to peek in through a window from a neighboring home, and so Langley bought that property for $7,500 in cash. At one point in 1941, a small fire breaks out inside the home, and firemen come and they put out the fire, but Langley again won't let the firemen talk to, see, speak to, have any exchange whatsoever with Homer, and so they leave. In 1932, right before he went blind, Homer, they did actually buy the house at 2077 Fifth Avenue because they had this notion of turning it into an apartment building, but those plans got scuttled by blindness and essentially mental disease. But since they never paid any of the bills associated with that house, the property is repossessed by the city of New York. And then at one point they're asked to pay $1,900 in back into income taxes as well. And Langley begrudgingly apparently paid paid for the repossession, but blew a gasket about it because he has an argument here. We have no income, so how can we possibly owe income tax? Because neither one of them had worked in decades.
Mm-hmm.
So again, rumors and legends just are rife and get bigger and bigger, and they're getting wider attention. 1938, they are offered $125,000 to sell their home, and they of course say no, but that just gives them more exposure. So an article they're written about in the New York Times. The Times, in this article refers to them as hoarders, and also in the article says that they obviously must live in some sort of, quote, Orientalist splendor. Apparently they have, who knows what that means. It's a really fancy high-end Japanese tea garden inside. I don't know what that means. But again, there's this notion of piles of cash and gems and vases. I don't know, because they were weird and hoarders, and they obviously didn't trust banks, and so obviously this house must be chock full of cash. Totally untrue. They were barely solvent at this point, but nevertheless, that was the notion. After the Times article ran, a reporter with the New York World Telegram, a woman named Helen Warden, kind of got interested in them and somehow managed to get an interview with Langley. And he tells her that he'd stopped playing professionally after he had to appear on the same bill at Carnegie Hall with Paderewski, who was a pianist, but who later became Prime Minister of Poland, and apparently was also a gifted musician. And that was apparently so demoralizing, he just couldn't go on. He said, quote, Paderewski followed me. He got better notices than I. What was the use of going on? And he dressed in cruddy clothes because, quote, they would rob me if I didn't, unquote.
Okay.
Yeah, no. 1939, workers from Consolidated Edison kind of forced their way into the house. The gas service had been turned off in 1928, but there were still two gas meters there, so they came to basically repossess the gas meters. So those walked off. But again, another crowd of quote of at least 1,000 people stood and watched. What?
My God.
The busy intersection. Okay. August 1942, the Bowery Savings Bank threatened to throw them out of their house because they hadn't paid their own mortgage for 3 years. And then that same year, the Herald Tribune again managed to interview Langley and asked about all the bundles of newspapers that were in the house. And Langley said, "I'm saving all the papers for Homer so that when he regains his sight, he can catch up on the news." Unquote. November 42. Bowery Savings Bank finally does start eviction procedures and sends a crew to the house to start cleaning it up. And Langley basically attacks them. So someone nearby, neighbors apparently call the police. Police arrive at the house, manage to force their way in. It's a little bit unclear how they get in. They attempt to smash down the front door, but there is just a pile of just stuff behind the front door, stacked from floor to ceiling. They do finally get in. They find Langley sitting basically in a clearing in the middle of the debris on the ground floor. Without saying a word, he hands them a check for $6,700, paying off the mortgage in full, and then orders everyone out of the premises. And they, at that point have no right to stay there, and so they all leave.
So he had the money. They had the money. He just
They had the
didn't-
money. He just wasn't bothering to pay it. Right.
Well, I mean, in all fairness, he's a busy guy. He's got a lot of stuff to do.
Yeah, I've got rusty springs to collect off the street. Right. March 21st, 1947. A man identifying himself only as Charles Smith calls the 122nd Police Precinct Station and insists that there is a dead body in their house. The caller says that there is the smell of decomp emanating from the house. I'm sure the dispatcher was like, "Oh God, what's the address? Again? You seriously?" But because they have to, they send someone out to the Collyer's home. The responding officer again had a hard time getting in the place. There's no doorbell. They don't have a working telephone. All the doors are locked. All the basement windows are broken and boarded up, and then also protected by a grill work or whatever burglar bars. So 7 guys work, and I judge in this case they do finally manage to get in through the front door, but basically they're heaving junk over their shoulder as they're going in, right, and just throwing it out onto the street. The foyer was just packed solid mostly with newspapers, but also folding beds and chairs and half of a sewing machine, part of a wine press, and a bunch of other junk. Another patrolman managed to break in through a second-story window into a bedroom. In this bedroom, there were packages, more newspapers, empty cardboard boxes tied together, the frame of a baby carriage, which is weird. Like they had no children. A rake, a bunch of umbrellas tied together, and they kept digging and digging and digging. After 5 hours pilfering through this house, they find Homer Collyer's body in an alcove. He is completely surrounded by boxes and newspapers, piled to the ceiling, basically. Homer's wearing a bathrobe. He has long gray hair, past his shoulders because he hasn't gotten a haircut in years, and he's pitched forward on this chair. It's basically his head is resting on his knees.
Mm.
Medical examiner comes through, confirms, yep, this is definitely Homer, and announces that the older brother had been dead for approximately 10 hours. So 10 hours, that becomes important later on. And the medical examiner also says that he died from starvation and heart disease. So, at least initially, police are assuming that Langley is the one who must have phoned, call the police. My brother has died. Now I don't know what to do. Now I'm going to panic. And so they're betting that Langley somehow makes a phone call with the anonymous tip and flees. And then, so because that's their assumption, they, they stationed a police officer at the house, just waiting for Langley to turn back up because they think, okay, let's just hang out here for a while. He's definitely going to turn up eventually, but he never does. And then Homer's funeral is held on April 1st. So, well, 10 days later, and Langley's not at the funeral either. 2 days before the funeral, a bunch of rumors start to circulate that Langley had been seen getting onto a bus heading to Atlantic City. So a big manhunt is launched in New Jersey up and down the shore. That turns up zilch. And then, as is always the case, there are a whole bunch of other reports. All these tips start coming in. And Langley is cited in a total of 9 other states. I'm sure chewing up all kinds of resources looking for this guy. While this is going on, New York City police are continuing to search the house. After the first 2 days, they have removed 3,000 books, several outdated phone books, a horse's jawbone, a Steinway piano, an early version of an X-ray machine, lots and lots of newspapers. So more than 19 tons are taken out of the ground floor. They keep working their way up the house for another week, removing another 84 tons of
my God.
stuff from the house. Some of this stuff is medical supplies and equipment from their father's practice, and a large portion of it is just the random stuff that Langley picked up when he was out walking around in the middle of the night. Outside the house, on the street, about 2,000 people stood and watched. And there are some short video clips on YouTube. Like, wow, you people need something to do. Sitting on the street, watching a house be cleaned out.
And there's a bookie out there taking money on how much do you think is going to get taken out today? How many tons of stuff?
Right. April 8th, 1947, a workman finds the body of Langley Collyer just 10 feet from where Homer had died.
Oh.
So Langley was found in a 2-foot little tunnel that was lined with bed springs and a chest of drawers and some other things. His body, which was the actual source of the smell, because a body after 10 hours doesn't smell yet. It has to sit for much longer than that. So it was Langley that was the source of the smell. It had been chewed on by varmints, and under a suitcase and newspapers and bread boxes. They figure, medical examiner determines that Langley probably died around March 9th. And
holy cow.
Yeah. So exactly a month he's been laying there. And their guess is that Langley was crawling through the tunnel to bring food to Homer, but he tripped one of his own booby traps, and a few hundred, if not 1,000 pounds of just stuff trapped him. And so his cause of death was asphyxiation. Both of the brothers were buried next to their parents, but in unmarked graves in Cypress Hills Cemetery in Brooklyn. The policemen and cleanup crews at the end removed between 120 and 140 tons of debris and stuff from this house. And this is actually, I'm going to read this verbatim from this article from Harlem World magazine. Quote, items were removed from the house such as baby carriages, a doll carriage, rusted bicycles, old food, potato peelers, a collection of guns, glass chandeliers, bowling balls, camera equipment, the folding top of a horse-drawn carriage, a sawhorse, 3 dressmaking dummies, painted portraits, photos of pinup girls from the early 1900s, plaster busts, their mother's hope chests, rusty bed springs, a kerosene stove, a child's chair, more than 25,000 books, including thousands about medicine and engineering, and more than 2,500 on law, human organs pickled in jars, 8 live cats, the chassis of a Model T, the one Langley had been tinkering with, tapestries, hundreds of yards of unused silks and fabrics, clocks, 14 pianos, a clavichord, 2 organs, banjos, violins, bugles, accordions, a gramophone and records, and countless bundles of newspapers and magazines, some of them decades old, and thousands of bottles and tin cans, and a great deal of garbage. Near the spot where Homer had died, police also found 34 bank account passbooks with a total of about $3,000. So that was the sum total, the sum total of it. The chair that Homer was found in was auctioned off and exhibited actually at Hubert's Dime Museum for a period of time. The house itself was in terrible shape and was deemed unsafe and was razed to the ground. It is now a little pocket park in Harlem called, I think it's called Collyer Brothers Park. Some of their stuff was sold at auction, fetching a grand total of $2,000, and the cumulative estate was valued at $91,000. And of course, a whole bunch of people came out of the woodwork claiming to be long lost so and so's. But eventually, there were, I think, 23 claimants split the estate eventually. And the term Collyer is what firefighters use when referring to a property that is a fire hazard, and it's a hoarding situation because those houses are not safe for a number of reasons.
A couple of things. I mean, there's a lot of things, a lot of questions I have about this. First of all, yours is the most detailed account I've ever heard of the Collyer brothers. Well done. Thank you. I've so many little tidbits in there that are brand new information to me. Is this the first time was this the first time hoarders was used in a mass media context?
That's a good question. I don't know whether it's the first reference. I mean, they are often used as kind of the gold standard of hoarding. I don't know whether this was the first case where that term was used in this context. So I'm not sure about that.
Secondly, I believe, I'm not sure, correct me if I'm wrong, but in addition to all the other stuff you mentioned, I think there was something like 113, 114 copies of REM's album Monster was also found there,
Wow.
which explains the glut of that album showing up in used CD stores, I think.
Yeah.
Poor Homer, man, just alone and blind and trapped in that house for weeks with his
For 4
brother's
weeks.
corpse.
Yeah.
Slowly starving to death. And oh my God.
Yeah, awful story. I mean, all I can say is don't hoard. I mean, I've been through some houses, in my life, in my day job. It's like, you know what? Maybe you don't need that box of Wheaties from 1995 that has the Cowboys on the front. Maybe you don't need the just the stuff that people. I mean, things that are actively used, like albums or comics or things that are
You're looking at me strangely, Bryan. Why are you
no,
looking at me that way?
I know you're an album guy and I mean things that are actually collected and maintained, but just collecting things to have them and having this, you don't need to keep your bank statements from every year from 1972.
No, get a shredder. Get a shredder.
Throw something away.
Mm-hmm.
It's cleansing. It's good for you. And by the way, if COVID didn't teach us all something very important, it's that isolation is bad for you. So do not. It's very, very hard, especially as we get older, to want to get out and be engaged and deal with people face to face, especially in the days of iPhones, etc. Not having other people around you is terrible for your mental health. Get out and be around people. Do not stay home. It's terrible for you. I'm just utterly convinced of this fact. Be around, even if they're go to a coffee shop and hang out, and don't stay home and rot in your in your own space. It's awful. I'm not a mental health professional. That's just my 2 cents.
It's just it is such a sad story, and it's
awful.
It's one of those classic New York stories that just it's a cautionary tale. It's so many things wrapped up into one just awful burrito of hoarding, and it's just, of course, they didn't have jobs. Langley was too busy collecting his stuff. I mean,
Right.
the bed springs? What was that about? I mean, you mentioned bed springs
Twice.
maybe. I mean, just no more than that, dude. Because you talked about it early on. He was found surrounded by bed springs. It was mentioned in the. I mean, what was him spring? Did he just like springs? I mean,
He's an engineer. I mean, springs are, I guess potentially quite useful if you're wanting to build, especially if you're wanting to build things that are booby trapped.
all I know is when I've gotten rid of certain collections and sold things and moved stuff on, and like when I had to clean out, I've lost both my parents and I've had to clean out two of their properties now. It's astonishing. It is astonishing. And I'm not going to do that to my kids. I'm not going to do it. It's going to be like everything we have is in these two rooms. Here you go.
We pared it down. Here you go.
Yes. Wow.
So
That's the most detailed retelling of the Collyer brothers I think I've heard, Bryan. That's wow, great job. That was horrifying and fun.
yeah, if you live up, somewhere in Harlem, the corner of Fifth Avenue and 128th Street is Collyer Brothers Pocket Park, and I mean, based on pictures, it looks like it is all of 30 by 70 feet, but it's got a couple trees and a couple benches, and there you go.
Wow. Well, I don't know. I don't know how to respond to that. That's just, ooh, it makes
That's
me
all I
want to
got.
go. Makes me want to go. I
Throw
don't
something
know.
away.
Yeah, just take a
But
bunch of. I've got my latest box of stuff to take up to our version of we got Second and Charles is out here, just old books and stuff, and just sell it. It's our version of half price books out here. Just get it, go it, take it.
right out the door. Right.
Yep.
All right.
All
Well,
right,
thanks
folks.
for listening, folks. We appreciate it. Please like and share and subscribe to our stuff. That would be hugely appreciated. DreamIdiots.com, Instagram and Facebook. We're at Dream Idiots. If you got a story idea, you can drop us a line at Dream Idiots Podcast. If they're really good ideas, email them in, because I check that email and Morris doesn't. So I'll get the benefit of your good idea, and I'll pretend it's my idea. But we appreciate you hanging out with us and listening to all of our foolishness every single week.
And hoarding stories make me itch, Bryan. I am just
Mission
yeah.
accomplished.
Be good to each other, folks, and don't hoard stuff. It's rough. All right. See y'all later.
This is a Rough Tiger production.
Bong bong. Bryan.
Bong bong.
Bong bong.
Bong bong. Good.